Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another session here at the Stoa. You might have noticed that I am not Peter Limberg, but I've been collaborating with him here at the Stoa for, well, I think close to the beginning of the sessions here. So I'm going to be running a little session today with David Collins, who I'm going to intro in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about the Side View, which is the website and publication that I run. I'll tell you a little bit about our structure, and if you're new to the Stoa, I'll just go over a little bit of kind of the protocol of discussion, questions, and things like that. So we're going to go for about an hour. We're scheduled until 6 p.m. And in that time, Dave is going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. I also have prepared a few questions that I want to ask Dave, just 3 or 4 questions. So in this first half hour or so, Dave will be speaking. We'll have a little bit of a back and forth. Then we're going to open it up in the second half for all of you. If you have questions or comments or just want to jump in the dialogue in one way or another, that second half will be for the larger discussion. The way we usually do it here is that you can either signal that you have a question during the period, or you can, while we're talking, while Dave is presenting, while we're having our dialogue, if something comes up for you, feel free to drop your question or your comment into the chat box. And then when we get to the general discussion, we can go through those and start to address those questions at that time. So in the first half, it'll be mostly Dave and I talking. But again, if something does come up for you, please feel free to put it in the chat box there. And then you can also indicate to me or in the chat there if you would like to read the question yourself or if you would just like me as the moderator to read it for you. You can do either way. So let's get going here. Like I said, I run a publication called The Side View. The Side View is a website, it's a journal, it's a podcast, it's an event series centered around the idea of practice, philosophical practice, contemplative practice, spiritual practice, but also practice of perception of any kind, really. So we're also interested in designers and scientists and athletes and engineers, people who have trained themselves, trained their perception, trained their awareness, trained their attention to see the world in a skillful way, to be able to engage and act within the world with some kind of skillful means. And the Side View, the meaning behind the title is just to say, instead of looking at the finished books, the finished works of art, the finished theories and ideas behind different philosophical or contemplative movements or traditions, we look at it from the side, right? To look at the practices that create the people who have those insights. And so I launched this website just over 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. And it really was one of those situations where I didn't know it was going to happen. When I launched the site, I had this idea. And, you know, they always say when you build something like this, you're going to attract a certain group of people who kind of responds to the call. You know, if you build it, they will come. And then who is they? I had no idea. But David Collins was one of those people. And he just kind of showed up into my orbit. And ever since then, we've had a very rich dialogue about the nature of not just philosophical practice, but religious, contemplative, spiritual, meditative practice, and the interrelations among all of those different disciplines and different traditions, and not just within one tradition, but across traditions. So I'm happy to introduce Dave. If you don't know him, he holds a master's degree in contemplative theology, another master's in world religion with a focus on Buddhist studies from Harvard. He also has a PhD in clinical psychology. So you're going to hear in the way that he talks a very sort of living sense of not just the academic and the scholarly, and not just the sort of practice-oriented side of contemplation, but also this sort of very practical and clinical and therapeutic dimension to everything that he's doing. So really, he's drawing from a rich training, a rich history, and that writing took him to study cross-cultural parallels in contemplative practices. Mostly, if you know the anonymous author of the Christian contemplative book, The Cloud of Unknowing, Dave has actually written quite a bit about that text in relation to Dogen's Zen Buddhist meditation instructions. So there's some interesting parallels there that Dave's research has been drawing from. And as I mentioned, he's also an adept meditator, having studied at the San Francisco Zen Center and insight meditation at Spirit Rock. And so he's written a few articles for us over these past few years. If you look in the chat box, I've dropped the links to the website and to his essays in particular. You can see the first one there is about that book, The Cloud of Unknowing. The second one is a very rich history about how mindfulness meditation was adopted and taken up in the Western context, both as a kind of assimilation of certain Buddhist practices, but also the way it's shown up in clinical practice. And then the last one is the piece that I actually asked Dave to talk about today, which is the piece on Socrates. The essay is called The Contemplative's Socrates. And I wanted Dave to talk about this piece a little bit because there's really an untold history that is supported by the scholarship and supported by our sort of best understanding of what this Greek philosopher Socrates, what his life was like, what his practices were like, in fact. And this richer, more complex story that Dave is going to tell us about really has a lot more to do with Socrates as a contemplative practitioner, and not just this kind of advocate for reason and dialectical questioning and erudite definitions and these kinds of things that you might learn that a sort of intro to philosophy course might teach you about Socrates. So I think it's actually important to learn this history. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave and tell us a little bit about the contemplative Socrates. So please welcome Dave.
Thanks, Adam. Despite, as Adam has listed, having an altogether embarrassing amount of education, I'm not going to mention the fact that I don't consider myself particularly a Socrates expert. I will say, though, that saying you're not going to say something, mentioning the fact that you're not going to mention something, is a rhetorical move and has a name. The name for saying you're not going to say something is an apophasis. Technically, apophasis means negation or denial. In rhetoric, examples like in a debate, we shall not mention his many crimes. Well, you just mentioned it. That's an apophasis. Also, saying something by saying what it's not. My grades aren't all that bad. You said your grades are good, but you said it by saying they're not bad. Again, rhetorical move, an apophasis. In contemplative applications, apophasis and the adjective apophatic came to be applied to those sorts of traditions and practices which, well, the Latin word often used is, or a phrase is via negativa, the negative way, the way of letting go, the way of stepping out from under conceptual, constructed, discursive thoughts and coming into contact with something more simple, more basic, more original, more honest, more humble. The words get big, apophatic, contemplative tradition, but it's about something quintessentially simple. There is, this is now my phrasing, a miracle going on. There really is, and it's everything. And it behooves us to reconnect with what's always already here before we're so identified with some of our cognitive maps, our philosophical opinions, our discursive frameworks for what's real, what's important. So the letting go, the getting simple, the questioning of our frameworks and concepts is what's gestured at by the word apophasis in the contemplative application. I didn't know a lot about Socrates. I'm working on a book looking, based off the dissertation that Adam referenced, looking at cross-cultural parallels in contemplative practices. And in the case of the folks I focused on for the dissertation, the Cloud author in England, 14th century Christian, and on the opposite side of the world, Dogen in Japan, very different cultural frameworks, very different theological vocabularies, but they're doing very similar practices, very similar meditative techniques. And it tickles my mind, in the case of those two authors, each over time went back and made edits to their original instructions, and they made the same edits. They're learning the same thing. The edits are in the direction of something even more simple. The words get complicated, even more ontological, rather than something conceptual, rather than something intentional. It's about a naked experience of being. That's the Cloud author's language, or an embodiment, a participation in suchness will be the Zen language. So I was interested in looking at how the Cloud author inherited that practice, that discourse, and going back to some of the beginnings in the West with Plato, and then of course before Plato, Socrates. And to my delight, came to realize that Socrates was a deeply religious human being. Popularly, he's understood as sort of the parent of rational philosophic enterprise in the West. So much of our popular sort of inheritance of how to think about philosophy is shaped by his follower, Plato, and even more by Plato's student, Aristotle. Much of the way the word philosophy, philosopher is constructed, conceptualized, is Aristotle, then projecting back to Plato, Socrates, and the so-called pre-Socratics. As a quick example, Plato will gesture towards an ancient quarrel between the philosophers and the poets, the myth tellers, the musicians. But Plato made that up. There was no such ancient quarrel, in part because Plato himself is using that word philosophy for a first time in the way we end up understanding that word. And some of the folks who do get understood to be quote unquote pre-Socratic philosophers were poets. They were writing poetry. Parmenides is a good example. Socrates was put into motion, embodied, exemplified, this sort of questioning of our conceptual constructs, our presumptions, our inherited values, our habitual frameworks. Socrates was all about asking annoying questions. getting people to reflect on things like what is piety, what is courage, what is temperance, moderation. And as often as not, especially as portrayed in the dialogues from Plato, the folks he'd ask these questions would end up realizing they don't really know, and would end up in the Greek word is aporia, an impasse, being at a loss to know what to say or think. That examination of our assumptions, that interrogation of our concepts, and I'll not be able to resist referring to the Cloud again. In Middle English, the language of the Cloud author, the way you spelled the word concept was C-O-N-C-E-I-T, a conceit. And I always am reminded of that when looking at interrogations of thought concepts, our conceits, the notions that we have a certain investment in and tend not to question. Socrates was all about asking questions. He purported, he acted as if he were ignorant in order to have people explain to them what's real, what's valuable, what do they live their lives by. That kind of ignorance, that kind of interrogation of thought structures puts into motion, not that others weren't doing it, but he does it in a way that ends up having immense influence on the rest of Western culture, puts into motion what in, for example, the Neoplatonists like Plotinus becomes a meditative process of letting go of thoughts, of coming to rest in what Plotinus will speak of as an unseeing or an unknowing, similar in the East to the Zen language about non-thinking, a practice of what's here before we have an idea of what's here. It's not so much blanking your mind as getting undistracted, being less identified with mere notions and ideas. Another aspect of Socrates' spirituality, and let me interject here, in his time, his part of the world, they didn't have a word which directly corresponds to our word religion. A closest word is piety, and is very much connected with practices. Athens of his time, you would typically have a couple of altars in your home to the gods. You'd pour a libation, a little bit of your drink in offerings to the gods before you had a drink or a meal. You and your customer in the marketplace would invoke the gods to bless, be present to sanction your business transaction. Festivals, ceremonies every week or so in Athens. As we don't know exactly how Thales meant it, an early thinker, but the phrase fits well for this culture. Everything is full of gods. They were mindful of having a transaction, an interaction with divine forces all the time. But it was largely performative. It was largely about how you did things. It was largely about following ceremonies and traditions, and not to do so much with having a creed or a set I believe orientation. As part of that, the Greeks were open to other deities, other divinities from other cultures, and adopting them if the community, if the assembly was into it, approved of it. A problem with Socrates is that he had his own style, he did things his own way, and he had in particular something like a guardian angel. The Greek word for it is daimonian, Translated as sort of a divine thing, and described different ways by different folks. But it was a sort of, Plato describes it as a voice, and Xenophon describes it as a kind of a sense of an omen that in Plato's characterization would tell Socrates not to do something if it wasn't a good idea. Xenophon says it also prompted him to do some things like give advice to certain people. He had it since childhood. So this paragon of popularly conceived rationality had a spirit, had something he was in conversation with, so to speak. But it was his own, it wasn't sanctioned by the populace, and given his more than potentially, given his disruptive manner of asking folks what's really real, what really matters, and disturbing to the sort of mainstream, he was getting young people to question their parents about their values and styles and habits. So along with having a divine thing that wasn't approved of by the community in a time and place where spirituality was very much a communal engagement. He was doing his own thing in such a way that enough people thought that was disruptive or even dangerous that he was charged with corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. And enough of the Athenians felt that was unacceptable. It got him condemned and executed. But again, how we see philosophy. I liked in the talk of the Stoa the other night, James Cars and John Vervecchi, the way John used the word reverence reminded me of a way we can interact with the philo, the love word in philosophy, a reverence for wisdom, which is a different thing than a sort of conceptual decision or arguing about propositions and claims. It was very much, as Adam alluded to earlier, a practice, an experiential engagement. It was, and this is a whole nother talk, but my sense of looking at what philosophy meant, Socrates didn't use that word very much, and it was just sort of vaguely sophistication or cultured thinking before Plato. And in Plato, it ends up being, I very much, the more I look at Plato, the more I sense he was doing religion in another way. He was cultivating, advocating, looking past appearances to the miracle that everything participates in, which he called the good, as a transformative, dialogic, ultimately spiritual engagement. Later, Aristotle has a more rationalistic take, and we get a split. Again, to me, it looks like Plato's doing another kind of religion. The split between the way we understand religion and the way we understand philosophy kind of gets in motion with Aristotle, notwithstanding some of the practice transformative engagements of the Stoics or the certainly in the Neoplatonists. They're doing meditation. Plotinus is a stone cold contemplative. One last comment I'll make. This wasn't in the essay, so I didn't know what to do with it, but I've been thinking about it some more. It's some 20 years later, after his death, his execution, he's given hemlock poison, he takes it and dies. Some 20 years later or so, Plato does an account of that event in the Phaedo. And Socrates, he has Socrates' last words be, Crito, one of his followers, friends, we owe the god Asclepius a rooster. Make sure you get one. Don't forget. And then he dies. What is going on there? He had previously asked the jailer, when the jailer executioner brings him the cup of poison, whether he could do a libation, do a spiritual mini sacrifice, offer a little bit of it up to the gods. And the jailer says, no, you can't. There's just the right amount for what needs to happen. So instead of pouring the libation as a spiritual act, Socrates does a prayer, takes the medicine, covers himself up, gets ready to die, and then as a kind of afterthought says, we owe the god Asclepius a rooster. Make sure you get one. One of the characteristic features of Socrates, he didn't write anything down. Everything we know about him comes from other folks who wrote of him. And a lot of what came down, we've lost a lot of it. But what we do have, Aristophanes writes a satiric bawdy play about him. Xenophon does an apology, does a symposium, and then does some other accounts of Socrates' life. But Plato is the most creative and had the most impact. But each of these folks understood Socrates a different way. And that's my sense that that's a characteristic, that tells us something about what he was like. He got people individually in touch with what most matters to them, what they most valued, what they were most personally reoriented towards to appreciate and pursue. And this comes through in a rather dramatic way in different interpretations of those last words. We owe Asclepius a rooster. Asclepius is the god of healing. Nietzsche and others opined that Socrates wants to offer the god of healing a gift in recognition for the release from the disease of having a body. The god of healing deserves thanks because he's getting rid of his body. A contemporary scholar named Glenn Most, this seems a bit outlandish to me, but his take is that, like the allusion to the swan song, which is also in the Phaedo, the swans sing beautifully at their death because they know they're going to Apollo. They get a kind of telepathic understanding of what's going on. Glenn Most suggests that at the very end, Socrates became clairvoyant and saw that Plato had recovered from a sickness. Plato's not present at the end because he's too sick to be there. Seems a bit far-fetched to me. But another author who I don't know much more except for this piece he did, named Colin West, points out that Asclepius is not just the god of healing. By extension, he's the god of medicine. And the word for medicine is the same word for poison, pharmakon, from which of course we get pharmaceutical. And that he's somehow thankful for this event, this medicinal, he's reverent towards his poison. And a reason, by extension, and I'm going to close here, that kind of resonates for me. I've often used this example of experience from my childhood. So much of contemplative material, so much of what also gets dubbed mysticism, has a kind of abstract or mystagogic association. I've studied it up and down. I'm still learning. And I've done decades of meditation practice. But a way I often a story I often use to kind of gesture towards my sense of what's a core of contemplative experience. I went through what it's like to die as a kid. I'm 7 years old. I'm drowning in a crowded pool, but they don't see me. And I'm underwater. I hit the bottom. I'm there long enough that I go through what it's like to die that way. I lost consciousness. I'm gone. My little brother sees me, tells my mom screams, the lifeguard jumps in, pulls me out. I'm not breathing, I'm blue. He gives me mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. My poor mother, who's got some medical training, did not like the signs, but I came back. And when I'm coming back into awareness, I'm vomiting through my mouth and my nose into vomit that's already there in the grass before I became conscious. Everything hurt, everything ached, and it was utterly beautiful. The fact that anything at all was going on was its own worth and wonder. Before I could remember my name, the fact that anything was happening was enough, was its own worth. Now, this is the way in which Socrates moves me. He moved people in different ways, but I wonder about that sense of his gratitude, even for the experience of taking the pharmacon, taking the medicine / poison, an appreciation for the fact that anything at all is going on. So that's the talk.
Thanks, Dave. It's really rich terrain that you're taking us through here. You said a number of things that I think, if you haven't dug into the material and you haven't thought about it too much, or thought about it from this perspective, you've raised some points that would raise some eyebrows, is one way of putting it, I think. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we're used to thinking of like reason or rationalism and philosophy as kind of a method of rationalism, as like one pole of activity, and religion and spirituality as like another pole. And I think the controversial part isn't that in ancient times those two poles were much closer together in a kind of integral way. That's kind of historically established and just sort of the case, right? Like people readily accept that. But what people in modern times want to extract as sort of the gold of Socrates and Plato is precisely the rationality and the reason over and against that kind of religiosity. And as you mentioned, religiosity, religion, religious practice isn't a way they would have framed it at that time. But when we look at it, it looks more like contemplative practice, or at least related to contemplative practice, reason as nested within contemplative practice, than something that would oppose those two things. But so what I want to do first is just draw out like the other pole, the other, a person who's arguing for nearly the opposite of what you're arguing. And that person is John Cooper. He's a fantastic scholar, right? He's like scholar of the first order. No qualms with the quality of scholarship. You know, this is a person whose texts I learned from a lot. He's also studying these ancient Greek texts, Plato and Stoicism and so forth. But he's written this book, Pursuits of Wisdom, where he actually takes this up as a theme. And there he's arguing against Pierre Hadot and Pierre Hadot's vision of philosophy as a way of life, or philosophy as spiritual exercise. And I hear what you're saying as much closer to Hadot than to Cooper. But I want to read you this passage from Cooper and then ask you a question about it. And so here's what he says in his book, Pursuits of Wisdom. Cooper says, the essential core of philosophy is a certain specifically and recognizably philosophical style of logical, reasoned argument and analysis. One must take with utmost seriousness that what the ancient philosophers, following Socrates' innovative league, are proposing is that we live our lives from some set of argued through, rationally worked out, rationally grasped, and rationally defended ideas about the world and one's own place within it. A philosophical way of life is therefore, in fundamental ways, quite a different thing from any religious way of life. So my question for you here is, there's a certain sense of reason and rationality and a certain sense of religion operating in Cooper's analysis here. which I think is sort of more the mainstream view. But I want to ask you, how might we think differently of reason and rationality and religion, and how are we supposed to think the relationship between the two?
So on the one hand, again, notwithstanding my ridiculous amount of education, I went to school and then to the monasteries wanting to know what is most important, what is most valuable in being alive. And I'll approach teachings, texts, philosophies with a very pragmatic interest. How can this help me appreciate being alive? Part of that then lends to realization, as you alluded to earlier, the side view. Our sense of rationality, our understanding and construction of what religion is, our understanding, construction of what philosophy is, comes from somewhere. Those have histories. Those are generated events. And as a sort of parable, it would be too long to go into real detail to sufficiently explain it. But so much of contemplative practice is appreciating the miracle of any and everything the way it is here and now. The associations of mysticism with, like, say, altered states is a bit overdrawn, but I've done some altered states work through old school Buddhist jhanas, absorptions, synesthetic altered states. They occur in a sequence. They are remarkable. The Buddhists will say, don't get too enamored of them. Just having sweet experiences is the point, but having some restoration, having some recreation, but also just getting some further insight on what the mind is capable of is sort of their worth. Following a 10-day retreat, altered states, really profound. I mean, really remarkable, beautiful, tear-evoking wonder in a set sequence. There are more than this, but standard 4 states. They unfold one after the other. Following a 10-day retreat, doing that, I was doing it in my sleep. I was waking up at night in the middle of the sequence, together with what I can only kind of metaphorically call a body memory of having done the first couple before I woke up. What that tells me, like a side view of our historically generated notions of what's rational, what's religious, our very identification with ourselves in terms of our waking state, our waking cognitive process, comes from somewhere. Some part of me knows how to sleep. Some part of me knows how to do waking. Some part of me knows how to do the jhanas, whether I'm asleep or awake. So it's a little bit of a roundabout reply, but 2 points to repeat. Our sense of rationality is a generated phenomenon. It's booted up. And 2, we have the unfortunate propensity to presume that's the end all and be all. That's the starting point and the end point. That's all there is to us, is this rational, logical, argumentative mode. And in the last couple of centuries in the West especially, that's had a sad preeminence. It does us a lot of good if and when we remember it's a tool, it's a utility. But if instead we make an idol out of it, that's the only way to be a human being and to know verities and ascertain values, then we've sold ourselves short.
That's great, Dave. Thanks for that. I'm actually going to shift over to the questions in the comments, just because I see that Hunter has a couple of questions kind of tied together that actually address some of the directions I was about to go in anyway. So just looking at the time, I'm thinking maybe we can pass it off to a general discussion. Hunter, did you want to ask that question yourself, or do you want me to read it?
I'd be happy to jump in.
Okay, go ahead.
I just would like to try to disentangle the ancient sense of religion from the modern sense. And to me, the biggest confounding factor is dogma. And so I wonder if you have anything to add about that and its coercion upon, anyone who adheres to a given religion.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, the Greeks in generations after Socrates and Plato became increasingly acquainted with the Hebrew scriptures and called them philosophers, that they had an ancient wisdom. There still, wisdom is about what enhances our appreciation of life. But throughout the centuries, throughout cultures, there's, to oversimplify only a little, a inveterate tendency human beings have that when they find something useful and valuable, there's the propensity to think this is the only way it's done, and to make an idol out of it, to identify with the discerning characteristics of it, and too often to become, as your word, dogmatic about it, presumptuous about it, conceited about it, and to lose touch with the sort of humble, original, practical, experiential connection with what was of worth and wonder in the genesis of the thing. I have a Presbyterian friend who's a bit of a cut up, but sharp as a tack. And I asked him one time, so much in the Protestant ethos is my understanding is you have a conversion experience and you're done. And he says, I feel like we need a conversion experience every day to overthrow our conceits, to overthrow getting too comfortable in our potentially dogmatic decisions about what's what.
I really appreciate, I just typed in the chat, I can't help myself, but just appreciate how you relinked back toward the word conceit that you mentioned earlier, and how that links to preconceptions and assumptions. And that's something that we should all throw to the ditch if we can, because it's full of lots of errors.
I'll borrow from your language, relink is an etymological meaning for religion, to reconnect.
That's great. Okay, we got another one from Nathan. Nathan, did you want me to read it, or do you want to read it?
I can read it. I guess one thing that sort of struck me was the mode in which Socratic inquiry was undertaken, both in Socrates' lifetime and also by his disciples in the form of dialogue. And there's a great book, I think, Preface to Plato by Havelock, that actually is in some ways kind of a side view of what was happening in ancient Greek culture at the time. It was a shift from the oral culture of people repeating, Homeric epics from memory to writing things down. And he argued that the significance of Plato's philosophy was trying to preserve this kind of oral dialectic of interrogation of asking these questions about what is justice, what is piety, and then through this dialectical engagement of provoking an insight about the true nature of reality. But this is the media ecology, in the ancient Greek world. And now that we live in the world of electronic communication, can the internet, can Zoom serve as a vehicle for types of contemplative practices like Socrates practiced? Because I think there is both a promise and a peril, from the different shifts, from the ways in which we communicate, information, and try to hopefully provoke, a realignment or a shift in understanding about ourselves and relationship with the whole.
So you may know, Socrates himself was chary about writing. He felt there was too much of the potential, as you allude to merely hanging out with the words and no longer having the lived dialogic, interpersonal uncovery and discovery and experiential engagement. Plato reflects that he writes dialogues. People are talking to each other, they're having conversations, they're questioning each other. Even in Parmenides, Socrates gets shown up as not knowing what he's talking about his talking about the forms, which incidentally is worth remembering. So much of the time we ascribe to Plato this dogmatic metaphysics about the forms and everything participating in them. There was something he's exploring, and in Parmenides, he tells Socrates, you know, this doesn't make any damn sense. But I'm reminded a little overly clunky. To me, so much of this comes down to an adverbial matter. How we do what we do, how we be the miracle that we are, how we engage with one another artistically, poetically, transformatively. And I think the resources are amazing. And at the same time, it requires that sort of personal engagement. I was so moved, the Stoa meeting the other night, how much fun John Favecki seems to be having with his explorations, and how content James Cars seems to be. It's an experiential, transformative, how they are enjoying their discourse, their explorations. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Dan, did you have a question? Did you want to type it, or did you want to just ask?
I can just ask, thanks. I really liked your quote before where you said, everything was full of gods. That's a very intriguing line. And recently, in our meetings here in Florida, I found it very interesting that people like discussing that ancient form, God, nature, logos. And we've also been talking about Spinoza. So I wanted to ask you, since the ancient times, are there any other authors or great thinkers who also discuss this idea, and can you recommend anyone?
So the folks I'm most familiar with are the ones who are concertedly engaged with contemplative practices. And in our part of the world through the centuries, that's usually come under the rubric of spiritual and religious writers. Although I already mentioned Plotinus, for whom, whether it's philosophy or whether it's religion, isn't the question. He's doing something transformative. He's doing something practical and experiential. He influences Christian theologians as they come to sort of have hegemony in the culture, folks like Gregory of Nyssa, and then the so-called pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, who's very much influenced by Proclus, also a Neoplatonic philosopher, Evagrius, John Scotus Erigena, the Cloud of Unknowing, John of the Cross. In our day, the centering prayer movement. There's a thread through all of those figures, and there are other ways to do transformative practice. There are other styles of contemplative and mystical experiential process. But it's not hard to find folks doing very similar questioning of assumptions, looking to reconnect with what's always already here, the miracle of living being, before we have a philosophy, before we have a religion, before we have a notion about it. I'm reminded in the Buddhist tradition of an iconic archetypal image on the verge of his awakening. The Buddha is sitting under an enlightenment tree, and the demons realize if he wakes up, they're going to be out of business. So they're interested in knocking him off course. They come in with all sorts of displays and distractions, and finally just ask, by what authority? What like gives you the right? What is your what makes it okay? Who speaks for you and what you're doing here? And in reply, the Buddha just reaches down and touches the earth. What's already true before I have a philosophy, before I make up notions about it, reaching down and touching the ground. Human beings have done that since forever, as long as they've been human beings, and you can find them in different cultures in different times.
Okay, I think we have time for probably one more. Alf, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, David. Sorry if you covered this in the article. The link didn't work from the last show. But I was wondering if you could connect Zen awakening and Socrates' idea of transformation. Socrates kind of debated with a natural philosophy because it could point to logic and some truth, but wouldn't provide transformation. I was wondering if both of their ideas of transformation from Zen to Socrates, are they both a form of I don't know mind, but with a participatory knowing?
So we get a sense, a kind of inference of how profound, a wise, and even loving person Socrates was, as much as he was also a nuisance and a nudge. By the fact that of the major philosophic practice schools, almost all of them trace their inspiration to Socrates. The Cynics, the Stoics, the Platonists, indirectly the Aristotelians, the Cyrenaics, the Cyrenaic hedonists and Pyrrhonic skeptics. They've got different discourses and different practices, but they're all inspired. They're all provoked. And that gives me a sense that Socrates was touching something living. He was hitting a nerve. People couldn't, some of them did, ignore him, walk away, don't get into it. But that speaks to me of something experiential, something personal, something vital. And again, we can get different languages, different words, different labels for it, but just that sense of questioning. Thinking of a moment in the documentary movie of the Talking Heads Stop Making Sense concert. At one point, David Byrne just looks at his hand and says, how do I work this? What is going on? That's the quintessential question. Socrates will nuance it a little bit about and ask, what is valuable? What's worthwhile? What is this? How is it that we do this? How is it that we make sense of life? And sounds deeply, simplistic, but it's just utterly profound in the end. And again, you can find folks, as you allude to, the Zen suchness people, getting people to question their presumptions, getting people to reconnect with the simple. There's a mythic Zen tale where the Buddha gives a sermon and folks are enthusiastic and want to celebrate it and commemorate it and say, this will be a good place to erect a temple, to build a temple. And the god Indra jumps down, puts a blade of grass in the ground and says, the temple has been built. Just what's happening, what's always already here, spread out on the earth. Thanks, Alf.
Thank you.
Okay, we are just about coming up on our time here. Does anybody have a final thought, final quick question? No? Okay, I think we're good then. Well, I want to thank Dave for coming to the Stoa and sharing his work with us. If you want to know more about Dave, the links are in the chat. From the links, you can also get his Twitter information and more information about Dave that way. And also want to thank Peter and the Stoa for hosting us and for hosting this conversation. It's great as always. Many of you know that Peter runs the Stoa as a gift economy. David has put together this talk as a kind of gift. So I know that the folks running the show behind the scenes here would also appreciate any gifts that you might have in return. So I believe you can find that information on the Stoa website if you feel so inclined. But other than that, I think we can wrap it there. Peter, did you want to close out on anything else? Any announcements or anything?
Oh, that was spot on, man. You nailed all of it. Yeah, just check out the website. We had some exciting events coming up. Daniel Schmachtenberger is coming Monday to talk about meta-modern Stoicism. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, and thank you, David and Adam, for hosting this excellent session.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, everybody.